Statistically, you are more likely to die in a hospital than in any other building. Not at home, not surrounded by candlelight or music, but here, beneath bright fluorescent tubes, beside machines that hum and blink, among strangers dressed in scrubs. As a doctor, I've stood in that light more times than I can count. I've watched people leave this world quietly, and I've watched them leave violently, pulled back and forth by a system determined never to admit defeat. Each time I'm reminded of a truth we rarely say aloud: medicine can keep the body alive long after life itself has gone. This is David's story. He was 66, still working full-time, still cracking jokes about how retirement was for people who'd given up learning. He kept an office lined with books on finance and a jar of boiled sweets on the corner of his desk for anyone who visited. At home, his wife, Miriam, teased him for his terrible puns. His daughters, Emma and Sophie, rolled their eyes but laughed anyway. Every Sunday, the family gathered at their dining table. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the smell of rosemary from the garden. David always poured a glass of red wine and made the same toast. To ordinary days, because they never feel ordinary until they're gone. He wasn't the kind of man you'd call reckless, but he had one blind spot: high blood pressure. He didn't feel ill, no pain, no dizziness, no warning. When the pharmacist reminded him, he'd smile and say, "If it's not broke, don't fix it." That Tuesday morning started like any other. The sun was sharp through the bathroom window. Miriam ironed a shirt while David adjusted his tie. He felt a dull throb behind his right eye. Nothing major. Probably dehydration, he thought. He kissed her on the cheek and promised he'd pick up dessert for dinner with the girls. At 10:30 a.m., his colleague heard a crash from the next office. Papers scattered across the floor, coffee splashed the wall. David was lying sideways on the carpet, eyes open but unfocused, one arm twisted beneath him. They called for help. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Compressions, oxygen mask, the calm choreography of urgency. His blood pressure was 240 over 130. The monitor screamed danger in numbers. The ambulance doors burst open at the emergency department. I remember the paramedics' brief handover. 66-year-old male, sudden collapse, GCS3, hypertensive crisis, suspected intracerebral bleed, intubated in the field. They wheeled him past me, tubes trailing, ventilator hissing. His skin was waxy, pupils unequal. Within minutes, we had him in the scanner. The CT loaded onto the screen, a massive right-sided intracerebral hemorrhage with intraventricular extension, midline shift well beyond the septum pellucidum. The pressure had crushed the opposite hemisphere. I've seen thousands of scans, but some stop you cold. This was one of them. Neurosurgery reviewed it remotely. Their verdict arrived like gravity: not operable. Prognosis: poor, likely non-survivable. We stabilized him. Propofol for sedation, noradrenaline to maintain perfusion, mannitol to pull down swelling even though we knew it would change nothing. The ventilator rhythmically delivered life into lungs that no longer remembered how. By the time Miriam reached the hospital, he was in intensive care. The unit glowed blue and green with monitor lights, every bed a small universe of hope and heartbreak. A nurse guided her in. She froze when she saw him. The tube through his mouth, the lines in his arms, the machine breathing for him. She reached for his hand and said softly, "David, I'm here." That evening I met her, Emma and Sophie in the relatives' room. It's a small space we use for the hardest conversations. 2 worn chairs, a box of tissues, the sound of the ICU pumps bleeding through the wall. I introduced myself, explained what had happened, showed them the scan. "The bleed is large," I said. "It's affecting areas of the brain that control consciousness and vital functions. Even with the ventilator, he isn't aware. The swelling is pushing the rest of the brain sideways. Surgery isn't possible." Miriam stared at the image, white blooming where the bleed sat, black ventricles crushed to a sliver. "So, you can't take it out?" "No, removing it would cause more damage than it saves. I'm so sorry." Emma crossed her arms tightly, holding herself together. "But people recover from strokes." "Some do," I said, "but not from one this size." Then came the words I've heard in every ICU. "Do everything, please. He's strong. He always beats the odds." And just like that, the plan shifted, from acceptance to battle. We increased sedation, adjusted the ventilator, started vasopressors to keep his mean arterial pressure above 80. Every action felt purposeful, but deep down we knew we were buying time, not life. At midnight, his ICP climbed despite mannitol and hypertonic saline. The brain was swelling against the skull. The numbers blinked red, relentless. I documented no brainstem reflexes, GCS3, pupils unequal, fixed. Each line clinical, detached, but behind every keystroke, a weight. Outside the glass window, Miriam never left her chair. The daughters took turns resting their heads on her shoulder. The clock on the wall ticked, indifferent. By dawn, his kidneys were failing, urine output near zero. We discussed dialysis, but it felt absurd. The machines already running were doing the work of every vital organ. Adding one more wouldn't change the ending. I made a note to review with the family again that morning. When I walked back into the ICU that morning, the lights were dim, the kind of soft amber glow that tries to imitate sunrise. David's ventilator sighed with steady rhythm. His monitor traced shallow peaks, heart rate in the 50s, blood pressure barely sustained by noradrenaline running through a central line. The night nurse handed over in quiet tones. No neurological change overnight, doctor. Pupils still fixed. ICP persistently above 30. Urine output minimal. He's had one desaturation to 80%, responded to suctioning, otherwise stable, for now, stable. A word that hides its own irony. Miriam was still there, eyes red, fingers curled around the bed rail. She'd slept maybe 20 minutes on a plastic chair. Emma and Sophie had gone home briefly, promising to return later. I sat beside her. We're reaching the limits of what medical treatment can do, I said softly. His brain injury is extremely severe. The swelling continues despite everything. She listened but didn't speak. We'll keep him comfortable, I added. But the machines can't reverse this. They can only keep the body functioning. Miriam whispered, but his heart's still beating. Doesn't that mean something? It does, I said. It means the machines are doing their job. But the part of him that made him him, that part is gone. Tears ran silently down her cheeks. Emma and Sophie arrived an hour later. Sophie brought coffee for everyone but didn't drink hers. They asked again if there was any chance. I explained the brainstem tests, the lack of reflexes, the meaning behind those blank pupils. Emma said, "You can't give up. He's a fighter. Please just keep going." So we did. That day blurred into routine. Arterial line calibrations, labs, ventilator checks, sedation holds that confirmed nothing had changed. Every few hours, the ICU filled with the sounds of machines adjusting, pumps beeping, suction tubes rattling, the rhythmic hiss of oxygen. Around 4 p.m, the neurosurgical consultant stopped by in person. I showed him the scans and chart. He shook his head gently. Non-survivable. There's no surgical window. You'll need to have that conversation soon. Soon. As though it hadn't already begun. In medicine, there's a term, treatment escalation plan. It outlines what we will and will not do if a patient deteriorates. For David, the logical plan was to step back, to let the process unfold naturally, but logic rarely stands a chance against love. By evening, his blood gases worsened, carbon dioxide rising, oxygen requirement creeping up. The lungs, heavy with fluid, were struggling even with maximum support. I gathered the family again in the relatives' room. They looked hollow, eyes glazed from lack of sleep and too much hope. "I wish I had better news," I began. "The swelling has worsened. His brain has stopped responding to any stimulation. We've reached a point where continued interventions are no longer helping him." Miriam clutched a tissue. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that if his heart were to stop, restarting it would not bring him back. It would cause injury, possibly break ribs, but it wouldn't restore him to the man you know." Emma's jaw tightened. "But what if you're wrong? What if he surprises you?" "I hope he would," I said quietly, "but we have to balance hope with honesty. Right now, medicine is only delaying the inevitable." They cried together for several minutes. Sophie finally said, "Can we think about it?" "Of course," I said. "Take as long as you need." That time became another day, then another. At 2 a.m, the next night, I walked past his bed again. The ICU at night feels almost spiritual. Lights dimmed, only the gentle percussion of machines and the faint hum of ventilators. I paused at his door, watching the monitor's green trace. Heart rate 48, BP 90/50, noradrenaline maxed. There's a heaviness that settles in you as a doctor when you know the end is near, and yet your hands are still busy keeping things alive. The nurse looked at me and whispered, "How long can this go on?" "Hours," I said. "Maybe a day. Not more." She nodded. We both knew what that meant. The body holding on through the strength of its own inertia, waiting for permission to stop. The following morning, the arterial line waveform flattened briefly, a sign of the inevitable. I prepared myself for another family discussion. When I entered the relatives' room, they were already waiting, Miriam between her daughters, hands entwined. "I need to be honest with you," I said. "His blood pressure is dropping despite maximum support. The heart is tiring. We're reaching the point where CPR would not bring him back. It would only cause more harm." Miriam stared at the floor. Emma shook her head, her voice sharp with fear. "No, you can't just let him die. Do everything." That single phrase echoed louder than the monitors outside. At 3:12 a.m., the arrest call came. "Cardiac arrest, bed 9. The sound of it through the intercom is unmistakable, sharp, urgent, final. We ran in. The ventilator alarm blared. The ECG trace flatlined. "Starting compressions," said the nurse. "Adrenaline ready. 2 minutes CPR, then rhythm check." The resus bay was chaos contained. I stood at the head, watching the chest rise and fall with each compression, the ventilator wheezing in forced rhythm. Miriam and her daughters stood outside the glass wall, frozen in disbelief. 5 minutes, no pulse. 7, adrenaline given. 10, still asystole. "No change," said the registrar. 15 minutes in, I looked at the monitor, then at the faces around me. "We're 20 minutes into the arrest," I said quietly. "There's no electrical activity. No signs of circulation. We've done everything." But through the glass, Emma's voice broke. "Please, don't stop." And so we continued. Another round, another shock, another set of compressions. Because sometimes compassion means enduring the impossible. At 3:32, I called it. "Time of death, 3:32. The room went still. The ventilator stopped. The alarms silenced one by one until there was only quiet. The nurse turned off the drips, disconnected the monitor leads. I signed the death certificate, noting cause as massive intracerebral hemorrhage due to uncontrolled hypertension. My handwriting trembled slightly, though no one saw. Outside, dawn was just breaking. The sky was pale blue over the hospital roof, a colour that always feels cruelly serene on mornings like that. When resuscitation ends, the room changes instantly. The tension that held everyone upright dissolves into something fragile and human. The ventilator falls silent. The monitor trace freezes, an unbroken green line that looks almost peaceful. The nurse closest to him removes the airway tube, careful not to disturb the stillness. She folds the sheet to his shoulders, smooths the edges, wipes a trace of dried blood from the corner of his mouth. These are the quiet rituals of medicine, the gestures that replace cure when cure is no longer possible. I stood at the doorway for a moment before stepping out to find his family. They were waiting in the relatives' room, eyes searching my face for an answer they already knew. I sat opposite them. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. "I'm so sorry," I said softly. "We did everything we could." His heart stopped at 3:32. Miriam's hands covered her mouth. A muffled sound escaped, half sob, half breath. Emma turned away, pressing her forehead to the wall. Sophie simply stared, as though disbelief might bring him back. I stayed with them for as long as they needed. There's no protocol for that, only instinct. Some families want silence, others want every detail. Miriam asked quietly, "Was he in pain?" "No," I told her. "He wasn't conscious. He didn't feel anything." She nodded through tears. When they finally went to see him, the ICU was hushed. Miriam walked to the bedside and took his hand, still warm from the compressions. "You're free now," she whispered. Emma kissed his forehead. Sophie lingered by the foot of the bed, watching the slow drift of condensation on the window. The nurse drew the curtain halfway, giving them privacy but not isolation. There's a fine balance between space and support in those moments. Too much distance feels cold, too little feels intrusive. After they left, the ward returned to its rhythm. Monitors beeped. The next admission arrived from A and E, a man in septic shock. Another life beginning its own battle, Hospitals never stop to grieve. They absorb loss and move forward because the next emergency is already here. I completed the notes, discussed with family, death verified, body prepared for transfer to mortuary. Each line clinical, efficient, detached, the only way to keep functioning. But inside, there's always a pause. I walked out to the fire escape at the end of the corridor. From there you can see the city waking up, the first buses, the sky turning from grey to gold. I took a breath and thought about how quiet death can be compared to how loud life is. Later that morning, I met the family again to talk about the next steps, the death certificate, the coroner's process, tissue donation. They listened politely, exhausted, their faces pale and expressionless. Miriam signed the forms with trembling hands. Before leaving, she asked a question that will stay with me forever. "Doctor, when we said do everything, what does that really mean?" I hesitated, then answered honestly. "It means chest compressions, electric shocks, tubes, medications to make the heart beat again. It's a violent process. Sometimes it saves a life, but when the brain is already gone, it only prolongs dying." She looked down at the paper she'd just signed. I wish I'd known that before. That single line captured everything medicine struggles to communicate. In the days that followed, I thought about David often, how easily preventable it might have been. A few tablets each morning, regular checkups, the small habits that seem unimportant until they decide everything. High blood pressure is called the silent killer for a reason. It asks for nothing, gives no warning, yet writes the ending long before we realise. I also thought about the family, the shock of watching machines take over, the guilt that often follows when they wonder if they made the wrong decisions. Families rarely need reassurance that we did enough. They need reassurance that they did. That weekend, I walked past the ICU again. His bed space was already occupied by another patient, another story beginning where his ended. The nurses had changed the whiteboard above the bed. His name was gone, replaced by someone else's. Hospitals are efficient at erasing evidence of yesterday. Still, you remember. That's the unspoken part of being a doctor. Every patient leaves a mark. You carry fragments of their stories tucked between routine and protocol. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how many of those fragments involve the same scene. A loved one on a ventilator, a family pleading for miracles, a team caught between science and mercy. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in the internal post, handwritten, folded neatly in a cream envelope, the kind no one sends anymore. It was from Miriam. She thanked the nurses for their kindness, for treating David with respect, even when the machines had taken over. She wrote about the funeral, how they played his favourite song, What a Wonderful World, and how Sophie read a poem he once recited to her at bedtime. And at the bottom, she wrote a single line that stopped me mid-sentence. I used to think a good death meant fighting until the very last breath. Now I know it means saying goodbye with peace. I must have read that line a dozen times. It captured in one sentence what years of medicine try to teach, that dignity isn't found in resistance, it's found in acceptance. A month passed. Life in the hospital went on. New admissions, new crises, another hemorrhage, another family sitting in that same relative's room. And every time I thought of David. When I talk to families now, I choose my words differently. I still fight for recovery when there's hope, but I also talk about how people die, not just if they will. I explain that resuscitation can break ribs, that a ventilator doesn't promise awareness, that sometimes the kindest thing medicine can do is stop trying to win a war that nature has already concluded. Because what most families truly want isn't endless medical intervention, it's to know their loved one was treated with care and that the end was calm. Medicine has advanced to a point where we can replace almost every organ's function for a while. We can breathe for you, pump for you, filter your blood, even restart your heart. But the one thing we can't replace is meaning. And meaning often fades in those final days when machines become louder than human voices. There is a quiet courage in choosing not to prolong suffering, a courage that often gets mistaken for surrender. But in reality, it's the deepest expression of love. Letting go before pain overshadows memory. I often think back to the start of David's story, to that morning sunlight through the kitchen window, his easy laughter, his promise to bring dessert. That image feels more alive than the machines ever did. If you ask me now what dignity in death means, I tell you it's when the last memory you leave your family isn't of chaos or alarms, but of peace, when they can remember your voice, your warmth, and not the sound of a ventilator. A few months later, I ran into Sophie in the hospital corridor. She'd come to drop off some leaflets for a stroke awareness fundraiser she and her sister had organised. She smiled faintly when she recognised me. "We're raising money for blood pressure monitors," she said. "We thought, if people can check at home, maybe fewer families will go through what we did." Her eyes welled but didn't spill over. She'd learned to carry grief with grace. That small act, transforming loss into prevention, felt like the closing of a circle. When I finish a shift now, I sometimes walk past the ICU before heading out. The lights glow blue in the darkness, monitors tracing the fragile line between life and death. I stop for a moment, not to check on a patient, but to remind myself why I do this work. Medicine is about saving lives, yes, but it's also about recognizing when to let life end naturally. It's about dignity, and dignity doesn't live in machines. It lives in silence, in touch, in honesty, in the moments when we have the courage to say, enough. So if you take one message from David's story, let it be this. Talk to your loved ones before crisis strikes. Understand what you would want if the unthinkable happens. Because those conversations, painful as they may seem, are the greatest gift you can leave behind. Clarity, peace, and the right to die with dignity. As a doctor, I've seen both kinds of endings, the ones filled with panic and the ones filled with grace. And I can tell you, the second kind stays with you longer. Statistically, you're most likely to die in a hospital, but how you die, that's still yours to decide. It can be dignified, peaceful, profoundly human, and sometimes the most compassionate act we can offer is letting go.